how you want.
Okay. Right. Basically, hi, Sarah.
Hello.
These are super relaxed conversations that I just have. It's sort of the good old permaculture principle, stacking functions. It's conversations with people that I know and appreciate who are doing amazing work in the world that I want to catch up with. And since life is pretty busy, and many of the questions that I ask them about their work, their life, why they do what they do, are also really inspiring for other people. And what I've noticed is by doing these conversations over the last few years, you build up a sort of very eclectic mosaic of different voices that over time make people realize that this is not just a few people saying, oh, this, that, and the other, but that there are people in very different walks of lives, with different foci, different language, different way of doing things, different parts of the world, also engaged in this process. And that's why, yeah, it's completely relaxed. We can talk about what you want to talk about. And normally what I start with is to just ask people to share a little bit from their personal story of yeah, the deeper motivation for getting into this work, what stirred in them to move towards being in service to life and community and a healthier planet. And I'm really excited to finally have this conversation with you because I mean, we've met a number of times in different Gen conferences and so on, but I've just observed from a distance that you're doing really brilliant work and also bridging the different communities, which is for me like recognizing another weaver in the system. So welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Daniel. And I remember we were supposed to do this call last year. I was in Pinhorn, and I remember I caught a cold trying to catch the aurora borealis that night, and I was just stuck in bed and like, I'm sorry, I can't do the call. But so grateful that we finally have this time, and that also I think the first time we actually met physically was at the Lush Spring Prize in 2019. But I followed your work, so grateful, and it's really an honor to be able to share. And I just looking at a lot of the material lately about regeneration, it's like how much over the years you've built that. So for me, I feel also I'm just a fellow weaver, but also just, I mean, walking behind you. You're steps ahead. So grateful to see so many people already doing this. And then also, yeah, for me, I feel it's hard to define the calling. It's so many levels, from personal to being part of a greater whole. That's hard to avoid, to not do anything and to take action, because being part of a culture that's so embedded in this reality that it's you can't not do anything. You can't look away. You can't yeah. And I don't know how to begin. It's a
I could ask you a question. I could ask you a question that I'm curious about. You grew up in the Philippines, no?
Yes.
And in Filipino culture, does it? I'm assuming, and this is all my just projection, that in cities people probably are already quite sort of in their narrative similar to the dominant global culture Western narrative. But I also assume that there's still in the villages a whole new way of being and seeing and interacting with the world, like still a aliveness of the kincentric worldview rather than the anthropocentric worldview. And like, how was it growing up in the Philippines, and in which of those cultures did you grow up in?
Thanks for sharing that. In very interestingly, I grew up somehow very westernized. We've been colonized by the Americans, so people are always like, oh, you speak such good English, because we have a very Americanized school system. But prior to that, Spanish colonialism. But we still retained a lot of our social like very kinship. Like we have the word kapwa to describe the shared self, the shared worldview. Like ka means shared. So most of our words about nature, kalikasan, shared creation, or kapatid, shared when you call brother, sister, ka, patid, shared, like you have a shared womb or something like that. And then, so a lot of our words have that kind of worldview. And it's so hard to separate ourselves from our identity. That's the collective. And growing up, there's also a little bit of the, like, when I talk to the diaspora, Filipino diaspora, they're always like, a lot of us are around the world, migrant workers, or those who have left the country during the martial law here. There's a lot of Americans, Filipino Americans. They're so longing for home. And then there's also this, when people are also very flexible and adaptive. So we can be very much wanting to be connected, but at the same time, we're so adventurous that we can, very, like, lots of Filipinos are migrants, are nurses, caregivers, mostly the people who are, there's a patch weavers, like we're the healing culture, I guess, what I hear. There's like a lot of us are nurses, a lot of us are caregivers, the sailors, the builders in the Middle East. So I think that's the culture we have. Like we're yeah, I don't know, if growing up in that situation, I grew up in I went to a university. It was very westernized, so it was really hard to decolonize myself as well. Like, even if I still have that culture, I'm from the global south, and then it was only when I worked with a film festival promoting culture and environment that it opened my eyes. And it was after after I graduated, and I realized, wow, we don't really have so much of this Filipino worldview and psychology in schools, where we learn about Socrates or like very Western philosophers. It was strange, and so I had to go dive into what is a research method that's very true to our psychology. And it's so beautiful to see the Kapwa worldview, the ways we are, going through our own sense making. This very, very, very kincentric, as you said. And now lately, not lately, but for many years, I've been working with indigenous peoples and shamans. And we don't call them shamans, we call them babaylans here. And babaylans, babaylan. In some parts, it's Balyan, it's Mambaki. There are different tribes that call them differently. And it's not something that I chose to do. It just came, like, it's very interesting to come across this path. And it's so beautiful to remember, and to play a role in helping bring that out in the world. And like, for example, I was involved in the peace process for many years, and being able to bridge the voices of indigenous peoples and their role there, and supporting their rituals and their remembering. So yeah, and also as an artist, a community artist, I also work with ritual and community. So it was natural it was a natural calling to support this kind of creating sacred, remembering the sacred in our work. So, and in a place that's, for example, in the work of political, like, for example, like the peace process was between the government and a former rebel group. But to create these spaces of remembering, it was something that I was really called to do, and really felt so drawn into, because there's a lot of planning that is done and acting that is being done from the rational mind. But working with indigenous leaders and these babaylans, they have helped us remember, like, we need to remember that this is not just a physical plane we're working with. Like, there's that level that healing and peacemaking that needs to be done with our ancestors and the spirits of the land that have absorbed the bloodshed and everything. So for me, that kind of ways of remembering that I've had the greatest honor to witness and to learn from was, yeah. And it's the same with other parts of the world. I've been part of interfaith cultural networks, and really seeing all these elders, they're wise Native American elders who are bearers of many prophecies and wisdom, and just to know that there are people who guard or guardians and keepers of this wisdom that are who are inviting us to this as I'm not sure who said it, but the ancient future is, like that is still already ancient. Was it Helena or Norbert Hodge or somebody who, I apologize if I didn't remember, but it's so beautiful to remember something that's already been known before, that we have to remember now. So.
This is so beautiful you're sharing this, because for me, if I sort of reflect on when you write a book or when you put something out, of course you have no control over how it lands in people. And you might intend to say one thing, and then over time you hear what people actually heard or read, and how they interpreted it. And one of the things that I was surprised by and feel like maybe I wasn't clear enough was that so many people have picked up this idea of regenerative culture in a very Western way as, oh yeah, there's this thing now that people suggest we need a regenerative culture. It's this new thing, and we like, and then once we can envision it, we can backcast from there, and then we can do stages. And it's again in that sense of the future, and the building some kind of utopia. And what you were just speaking to absolutely beautifully is, for me, the absolute essence of really working regeneratively in place, which is remember the story of place, and who can tell you the story of place. Those individuals who are still holding themselves to be emergent from place, expressions of place, guardians or custodians or architects of abundance or whatever you want to call them, but people who still care, love, and nurtured so deeply a place that their relationship is more, like the beautiful car, like family.
Yeah, and sorry.
And so what I'm noticing you do, and it's just beautiful, is to like I lately often describe it as, don't try to build the new in the place you're in. Look at the fire that is almost out, and between the ashes, there's still these glowing embers, and give them oxygen. And that's how you create regenerative culture. Because if regeneration, as we all hopefully believe, is part of life's regenerative impulse, it's fundamental to life itself, then we as life are entirely capable, and have for the longest journey of our ancestors been an expression of this regenerative impulse. And it happens still everywhere. And of course, in wisdom cultures that are still closer to the kincentric worldview, or where people still have an unbroken lineage of that, that's where you have to start with. But even also, I find in the West, when people tell me, like, where do you start? And I think it's all about falling in love with the biocultural uniqueness of place again, to actually come home to wherever. It doesn't have to be your birth home, but to come home to a place and really deeply relate to the story as it is being told by the people who are close to the place. So beautiful work.
Yeah. And it's also interesting when you say how, like, the regenerative cultures movement now, like the way that it's perceived, it needs to be in the future. The same goes, I think, with a little bit of the people who want to conserve indigenous knowledge and wisdom in the old way. Some of them are also stuck that it has to be that's the only way. But we have to think that culture is also living. It's a living tradition. So, like, for example, I work with like an indigenous elder who revived the 500-year-old peace pact between two tribes that were Islamized and non-Islamized, and their descendants came about so many tribes and different stories of the same story. But he tried to revive these rituals without clear set of instructions that his tradition needs to follow something from the past, but he's evolving it and encourage his culture to create new methods. Like his brother, they are promoting soil painting, and then they still call it their indigenous way. And then, like a shaman that I work with, Babaylan, she is an initiated Babaylan, but she's following the traditional lineage. But then because she's not from a tribe, some people are focused on we need to be in from this tribe, and but because her spirit guides communicate with the spirit guides of this land, so how can she connect? And she's been helping revive this, which was the beautiful thing is where do we start? And even for me, I'm still learning because like and it's such a beautiful experience the last 2 months. I've been working with this Babaylan. My hometown is one of the first Spanish settlements in the Philippines. So most of our heritage was wiped out. And I'm not saying one of the first, it's actually the first settlement. Like they really, it wasn't the first place they landed, but it's the first place that they really established. Like it's a like established it's a city, like and so most of our heritage was wiped out. And the last 3 months, we had this incubator with UNDP, Conscious Food Systems Alliance. And this, for me to actually go deep into my own story of the land, for me, it was so, considering that I've been working with a lot of these indigenous elders over time, mostly supporting their work. And for me, I came, because I've accepted and I come from a place where our heritage is mostly colonial. We've lost a lot of our pre-colonial heritage. And the Babaylan I was working with, we ended up talking to the farmers here. And I'm finding out that actually the farmers that my family has worked with the land I inherited, is that they have been making offerings to nature spirit for a long time. And then actually my ancestors have been supporting these rituals. And, come to think of it, it's under my nose. Like the whole time I was trying to work on this land. And it's in a way, for me, a wake-up call too. Like if you're the one practicing this, you're preaching this, you're doing this. And for me, like, how come I never actually went deeper? I just accepted that that's wiped out. And it's actually my own lineage and roots that actually have this hold wisdoms, that hold this wisdom. Like you said, the fire, you just need to feed the fire, or to, it's there. And the powerful thing is when we brought these indigenous elders to the city from the different parts of the country, they revived the rituals. We had a talk at the university, and one of the like the biggest university, one of the biggest universities university in the country, and they're very much dedicated to history and nationalism. But for them to actually say, the event helped us experience what we only read in the books, and so for us, something awoke here when we invited them to remember the story of this land. And I guess it had to start from me as well, that I'm helping create this space in the city, and we created this as part of our learning journey for our restoration lab, and we're bringing in all these stakeholders to restore the landscape. So for us to go deeper, it allowed us to also open up a lot of things, because there were a lot of things that couldn't push through, and it was so much in the head that we needed to go into the spirit and the heart of the land and their story, that kind of allowed us to, okay, we can move forward now, or do something about this and go forward to how this project can move on. So it was powerful, and I love how you said that metaphor of the fire and the embers. Literally just happened to me, so I'm just still reeling over it and like reflecting how to write about it, and yeah.
No, it's again, you just explained beautifully how to work from a place-sourced way, as people like Kara Sanford or a Regenerative group would call it. That sometimes before we get into the kind of thinking mode of action points and what could be done and what technology might be needed or whatever, there needs to be a more sensing, feeling, and intuiting mode that reconnects it with place and culture and history, in order to help us not impose something, but unveil something in terms of potential. What, have you got a gecko somewhere near you?
Yes, there's one living in the air conditioning.
Isn't it like...
It's very strange. Like he's just living there, even if yeah, because I rarely use it. So I really use it. It's part of the place I'm renting. So, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I
built a
remember them
whole.
from I used to be a scuba diving instructor for a while, and I lived on Koh Tao in Thailand and
Ah,
contracted dengue fever. And
oh,
for about 10 days, I was in this little hut feeling really, really terrible with bad headache and body ache and having to take codeine tablets and all that. And for some reason, in this tourist bungalow that I was renting, there was the Mexican Madonna pictures with the kind of, they're very
mm,
golden and like the Mother Mary. It was
yeah,
on the wall. And
Guadalupe.
yeah, Guadalupe, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was lying in my bed in a feverish dream, and there was a gecko behind that picture. So she was going, oh, oh. And then I didn't know what, like, I thought I was going crazy until I turned the picture around and realized it was a gecko.
Well, it's also some of the elders would say, they're affirming they're listening, if they're,
Nice. Okay,
yeah,
they were listening.
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah,
That's beautiful.
they're eavesdropping and they're saying, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Finally, they're talking sense. No, it's the other thing that I know about you is and you briefly mentioned it earlier, that which is another modality that I find is so undervalued um, in terms of fanning the embers of regeneration and regenerative culture and sharing, caring, nurturing, healing, restoring and regenerating. It happens on so many levels in social, ecological, and economic contexts. And how do how do we bring it together into culture that people begin to see it as a culture like that? Because the media always tells us that bad stories. We don't tell the good stories of how many people actually do care deeply and do nurture. And you said like your own culture is a caring culture, lots of nurses, not a healing culture. Um, so what I know of your work is that you always use the arts
Mm,
as another way of opening this up. And what I just heard you, and please correct me if I misheard it, which is a beautiful bridge that I hadn't really been conscious of, is that rather than going back to some sort of ritual that was developed in a particular time in a particular context that might right now in the modern world not fully connect to particularly the younger generation, um, to draw that the essence of that relationship that is being expressed through that ritual into the modern day. What would be better than engaging people through the arts?
yeah.
So maybe you can share a bit more about that work. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah. How do I even begin with this? Well, I would always start with like I shared with you, like starting, it has to start from myself first, right? Like I think as a regenerative practitioner, to
Mhm.
keep it integrity in our work, we also have to be on our own. And I started in the arts mostly for my own healing. I went through depression for a certain period in my 20s, and I used visual journaling for my own recovery. And I also recovered from domestic violence, and art therapy was something that really helped me move on. And and I realized when I was working in conflict areas with interfaith peace building was art therapy was one way to help communities recover from the trauma, because there's a lot of things that you cannot verbalize. It was the arts help express it for you in a safe way. At the same time, it allows a lot of like the unconscious subconscious part of us, a lot can, the things that we bury can also be revealed. And for me, that was one of the first, the real, the heart of why I did it as well. I pursued it. I studied art therapy and worked in conflict zones, and I worked in climate impacted communities, mostly as a trauma informed mental health practitioner and introducing the arts. And then eventually also worked with a doctor when my mom was diagnosed with cancer. I worked with an integrative medicine doctor together with an energy healer in the Philippines. Also, we try to use the arts as one of the ways to help map the body's story.
Mhm.
And and then in the same time, I also saw that when I work with communities using the arts, it was one way to arts and rituals, one way to bring them together. It's a shared language of um, especially communities, no? Because most of change making is often very action based or mind based. But when we use the arts, it allows us to bring out, a deeper purpose and calling. And like, for example, I work with this indigenous community in the north in Sagada. We use mandala making to envision the community's plan for disaster risk reduction. And they really illustrated like the intergenerational relationship they need to heal with the youth to come back to their homes. And it wasn't about preventing disasters in like the action, but it was the essence, the heart, like bringing our youth back or bringing our wisdom back. And then from that we drew out an action plan. So we actually made a log frame out of that. So for me, I like that it's not just the log frame, it's not just the action planning, but the spirit and the wisdom of the people are brought out in this way, because it's not something you can verbalize or make logical. And currently we're also trying to see like how can it be a means of helping document loss and damage that is non-economic. These are the loss of life, loss of biodiversity. Like there are things you cannot measure, but there are things that you can show that has meaning to this place, has meaning to these people, has value. And if you, because of the vulnerable nations now experiencing loss and damage, it's so hard to put that and quantify that. There's a way to actually also show that the climate data we're seeing has a story, like there's a narrative behind that, there's meaning behind that, there's value, and that's something you cannot buy. Like last COP28, there was this, financing commitments by many governments. And we also say that it's not even enough to the billions that is needed by climate vulnerable nations. But and then at the same time you ask, what can money really buy? If you've lost, so like people we work with, like they've lost family members overnight, in a flood, or how can you even buy that? Like the memories that you work with, or their sense of place, no? Like this island that we visited, their island is sinking, and so they have to move. So the memory of this place that they're part of, you cannot. It's not something you can buy. Maybe it can be at certain points, but that kind of value is different. So I think for me, the arts help create more meaning, like a meaning making process, and offer that sense of belonging and to a place or identity. And it can be very practical, as like we worked in a camp on a place where ISIS displaced an entire city. We work with a camp there, and even there are segregation bins for segregated waste so that they can separate the plastics, and so that we can compost it for the garden, the permaculture garden. That's another story of my work, the working with nature. But we also drew and painted their okir, their patterns, so that they feel a sense of home, even if they're not in their home, because their home was now like shelled out, and because of the siege in that city. So so for me, it's a very healing methodology. It's quite overlooked as a valuable methodology, but I think now more and more there's more value to it, because we're so focused on the rational part, but the relational actually helps sustain whatever is rational. Like whatever rational plans, you have peace agreements, or you have a long-term plan, but the relationships, the values, the culture, like you said, without that culture of trust or curiosity or kinship, it will not be sustainable. And we've seen that over time, and and that's something that, yeah, it's intangible but super valuable.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating that like just recently in the series of conversations that I do for this RSA Oceania Regeneration Rising podcast, I had Philip and I had this wonderful conversation with John Seed in Australia and a young woman called Sky Mendoza, I think. And John, who's been developing the work that reconnects with Joanna from the start, like both of them merge two ways of working. Joanna's previous work in despair and empowerment, and the deep ecology stream from Annes. And he reminded me again that for this, like there's one way of looking at life, the living human and more than human family of a planet transforming. That everybody alive is that amazing expression of life making it. 99% of all other species that were on that journey didn't make it. And so everybody carries, like, with everybody, I mean all life from soil bacteria to human beings to sequoia trees. And what he was pointing out, that even in our human journey of evolution, for the longest period of continuing to be among those who made it, it was pre-verbal. It was all about intuition, sensing, feeling. It was all about relational knowledge and gut. Like basically we survived because we learned to follow our gut. We survived because we learned to follow our hearts. And all of that is sensing, feeling, intuiting, the three important ways of knowing that, like, you know, Jung's 4 ways of knowing, where thinking is only one of them. And so we try to solve problems always from the intellect, when we even have the scientific research now in psychology that actually we make our decisions based on gut decisions, and then we post-rationalize our gut decisions. And that's why science and statistics come in so handy for some people. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're the right decisions, because they can be backed up with science and statistics. So again, for me, it's really pioneering the way that you're bringing in art and these particularly community art and engaged like collective art as a way of bringing in that transcontextual data, as Nora Bateson would call it, and she does it with warm data labs. But I think we need to experiment with all sorts of methodologies. I think that even song and dance and all of that could easily also contribute to these kind of more embodied ways of knowing.
So even like eating together, you know, culture is in the food, and there are many peace building activities that are actually cultivated just by eating together. It's not the round table of the paperwork, but actually when they ate together, they built the trust over time, because they connected deeper outside the boardroom, outside the, you know, and I think these are overlooked indeed. One thing that I'm sorry.
I'm conscious of our time, because we also want to do that other flip it and do the other interview bit. But there's one thing that I really would like to also include in this conversation, which is your relationship with raw meadows and permaculture and working with refugees, because you've mentioned, like, you're really valiantly going into the corners of the world where people are really suffering from deep trauma, whether it's environmentally caused or by environmentally induced wars that are popping up everywhere. And for me, raw meadows is one of those unsung heroes that have really trained up a whole generation of permaculture activists that see that permaculture can serve those most in need, both in refugee camps and in rebuilding, or in the transformation of what are permanent refugee camps actually into vibrant settlements. So please share a bit of that journey.
Yeah, so like I shared, I started more in the trauma response using the arts for psychosocial support for mental health. And in this work with peace building, post-conflict, and then post-disaster, climate-related disaster. So in that way, I also saw like, okay, the arts is, it's beautiful, but also it's also sometimes it's a luxury too, because some people still need to survive and eat food, and so that's where the soil and soul work need to be woven in my work at least. And so we work with permaculture as a means of food as a way of nourishing the body, but also the well-being, because once you feel more the nutrition from the food, you also feel a certain well-being. But it also became a place of refuge and healing, because creating these spaces offer people this therapeutic. A lot of studies have already shown that you work with the soil, it increases your serotonin, or so it's very therapeutic. From the plants that we grow to for food and medicine are also sources of place, a sense of place, memory of the place they cook the ingredients from their home. Or so those are the things that are necessary in our work. And so from the edges, we see, at least from our work so far, working in the edges, we also see like how can the future look like if because working on this for a while also gives me as like an opportunity to input, like how are we to make plans for resilience in the future? Because if we see the front lines, we've seen the most horrifying post disasters. Like you have buildings that are bent, body bags on the streets. So you have to it's like you will go to the future and you go back to this, okay, let's, like, how can we design this again to prevent this further. So realistically, it's hard to prevent these now because we've been trying to avoid this for a long time, and it's the reality in this work now is quite it's more really how to adapt and to be to lead with the complexity and uncertainty is something that is very, very I was just talking to Alfred earlier that when you plan in this kind of work, 50% things don't happen the way you plan to. You just really need to know, like, how do you be creative and in this approach. And most of it is telling us to come back to the basics and to the simple things, to design from within, to design with the existing resources, to design small, to design for resilience from that really clear center. Like, because once you're clear in the middle, the complexity around you you can maneuver it more. So like it's as simple as a small learning center, as simple as like a small group of early adapters, of community leaders, because not everyone will understand the solution of permaculture. But we saw that many innovators, the visionaries in the community, the leaders, the true leaders, not just the elected leaders, but people you see who have the vision and the curiosity to try something new. They're the ones, when you cultivate that, there's more integrity in your design rather than it's a mass scaling of let's teach everybody, or let's, and I saw that how valuable that is in our work. And if we were to scale something like that, is to support the small. So we've also been supporting the informal aid sector. We're trying to nurture a network of the breastfeeding moms who donate milk, or the bikers who go in the last mile, because the roads are blocked and damaged. So they bring goods. Or we're trying to build a hub for community mental health, so that people can map them and know where they are, or the seed banks. And we've been connecting the community kitchens with the farmer networks, and we've piloted how it looks like in the post-disaster, where we can bridge a farm and people can donate to a farm so that their produce can support the community kitchens in a displaced area. So that way they can support the farmers, they can support the community. And so that's also like, I feel like if there's a lot of, it's gentle power, but it's resilient. rather than we're not saying the mass scale humanitarian aid is limited. We're just saying that from a regenerative lens, it can offer more flexibility and creativity and resilience, at least from where we're observing these changes happening. And because there's a lot of aid that's being done, but they don't last long or they don't sustain. So, but we're also still in a process of helping sustain what we started. So I'm not also saying that we've done really like everything well, but what am I saying? So I think that's where I'm coming from. We're currently preparing a learning site that's a permanent learning site, because we want to save the cost every time a disaster happens. We're always there, and then we have to build up the fundraising, and then we'd rather invest in training people ahead. So we're working with Rosemary Marrow and other teachers working on regenerative resilience, and with Realliance also. It's a good network for regenerative aid and development. We're working with the university to develop a curriculum that's really meant for preparing people and to model what does an emergency food system look like, or what does addressing floods and landslide look like, and that many people will be trained ahead. So, and then how can our map of mutual aid actors feed into the humanitarian aid system so that they can fill the gaps and they can collaborate? Because often the informal aid, the mutual aid, they're the first to go in the community because they're already in the community. And then they're often the ones, the last to leave as well, or if not, even they don't leave because they're already in the community. So that's how we're thinking at the moment. I don't know if exactly describing.
It makes huge sense. And as I listen to you, I feel like the way that the world is going at the moment, and the way we're going to be tested with regard to how we respond to living through those decades where we're in the age of consequences of what we or our recent ancestors have caused, and a small percentage of them mainly in the global north, and everybody else has to deal with it. There'll be huge learning from the global south to the global north. Like some people sitting in the global north might think that that way of working is so far away from them, but it's not. It's come to Europe and to the States in so many ways in the last few like the last decade. And what you're actually doing, and I was also thinking of a man who's working with this in America, the Community Resilience Network there, Dr. McDonald, and it's so vital. But one thing that I also thought about with regard to the nuancing how to work with this regeneratively, and the trap that we sometimes, like, because permaculture is a sort of design-based approach, just like the EDE and Guy Education's work has used design as a kind of integration and implementation pathway. Sometimes we carry the kind of conventional idea of design, which is a little bit object focused. So what I heard you say is actually beginning to not do that, to actually pay more attention to building relationships, building capacity to see the system and capability to act in the system ahead of time. And if you do a small project, so in terms of the languaging, when you said like sometimes it's just a small thing like the community center or whatever, a seed store, to actually bring into the awareness of the people you work with that the most important outcome of doing this work together is doing this work together. And the relationships, the human contacts, the appreciation of who's got what skill and what can they bring if we need to be regenerative in a situation where uncertainty has just shown us life always comes different than you planned. Because ultimately, what for me, working regeneratively with community in places is about is whatever beautiful systems we implement on growing food more regeneratively, providing energy more locally and from renewables, finding transport systems that don't destroy the planet. All of that, of course, is necessary, and all of that has solutions and designs in it, and projects that need to be finished. But if we stop having that Western mentality of thinking that when it's finished and the object can be handed over and that it's done, and we go into saying, no, all of this is important, but the most important thing behind it is building social cohesion, building capacity to respond to uncertainty, building the capacity to, in the worst of situations, sit in a circle with a talking stick and say, what next?
Mm.
A way that is deeply rooted in what the place actually holds as potential. And then again, like I'm just amazed because there's so many people who talk about the framework of thinking behind regeneration, but that in so many different layers, you actually live it, work it, and work it with the people that most need it. I'm aware we want to do the other conversation, but there's one more question that I think would be super interesting,
Sure.
which is maybe a lead over. Coming from a country in the global south and seeing like the insidiousness of the kind of globalization process, the growth development process that somehow built up, and the UN had a lot to do with this, a developed versus underdeveloped nation. What Helena Norberg-Koch so beautifully describes in the book that you mentioned earlier, Ancient Futures, how deeply place-rooted regenerative cultures in just a few generations can be completely transformed by the advertisement industry and this growth thinking and this thinking of, oh, you might not have a word for poor because you live kincentrically and share and have an abundant life. But now that we're calling you underdeveloped, you're going to learn that you're actually poor people and you need to learn to be rich people. Yeah? All of that. It also came in with the UN. And there's a lot of critique around the UN. But then I also hear you and observe you doing really deep, beautiful work with this bridging into indigenous local cultures that is also co-financed by the UN. And I also have had this love-hate relationship through Gaia Education and the Global Ecovillage Network. We've never closed that door. We've always been like an ECOSOC, an Ecological and Social Council member to support that process. How do you find, because the development world is also very close to all of that, this tension between the UN process and what sometimes, like you mentioned, log frame earlier, and I think, oh yeah, it's like it's sort of like, okay, we've done all this wonderful work, and then we managed to squeeze it into a log frame. I mean, of course, you need to because that's what you report back. But yeah, maybe a little bit on that nuance would be wonderful.
No, it's good. I work with Kosha and Rob Wheeler for the Gen delegation at the COPs. And I really was so inspired to be part of that delegation because for me, it really helped show whatever the ecovillages have been modeling for 20 years, more than 20 years, to show it's actually being it's really needed now. And people are really saying that it's super valuable. And but there's also definitely that tension because of it's very bureaucratic, top down, and I think there's some shift happening. I would say, and I don't think it's easy, especially for the global South development sense because it's only emerging right now. Because how do I describe this? Like late, I'm part of the UNDP Conscious Food Systems Alliance, which is like I was just telling the people behind it. There's like we had this meeting last year in Schumacher College, and I was saying that when I shared this to my dad is a consultant for the UNDP, and he's very technical, and I always see him as I was growing up, like very burned out, always very like linear, and I was like, I don't want this kind of work. And then when I showed him the website, it's like, oh, we really need this in the system. And I shared that, and I used to be so, I always feel insecure around my dad sometimes because of this. Like, I feel like I'm not in the right place, like the way development approaches are in the traditional way. And I often feel out of place. And I realized there's, now that they're starting to realize how valuable it is. I know that the Presencing Institute is working with the UN SDGs, working with UNDP to promote awareness-based approaches to their work. So I'm sure it's not immediate, but there are people in the system who want to change it, but also are also frustrated themselves, because I hear they're also expressing like, we just want to channel this funding, but it had to go through so much bureaucracy. And so there's a lot of, and then we also had experience, it doesn't have to be the UN as well, it's the traditional change model, the development, like you said, the way development has been measured, the monetary, the GDP, or like even not necessarily the GDP, the impact driven, that's more measurable, numbers, quantity, and you lose the quality of the delivery, and you're very data driven, but you lose the story or the essence. And it was really hard to introduce an innovation approach, emergence, design thinking when we work with a humanitarian organization, because no matter how they wanted to do it, they agreed to do it with a contract and everything, and their system wasn't built for it, because the traditional, they have to know, we have to know what's the next activity, how many did it, but we are actually in the listening mode, like we're inviting people to listen to the landscape, to listen to themselves, and to listen, and then we will do a visioning, and then that's when we take action. Because when we are doing it the other way, where we're visioning, we're making a measure how to do it, but actually you haven't really listened to the man, you haven't really listened to yourself. Most of these projects don't really get sustained, or they may have success, but they're not as sustainable if we're really drawn from, this deeper understanding of the roots, the root cause, or deeper understanding of their role in the system and how they can contribute. And it's so in a way that system is also colonized in itself, and it has to, even when we did it ourselves, we work with Common Land also with doing theory U in the landscape, and to introduce, something that we realize is also very Filipino systems thinking. We realize that the theory journey is also the way Filipinos work with the landscape, work with the people, with our kapwa psychology. And so we realized we like the university I was in, we weren't taught this in school. Like we were taught a different kind of research method or psychology. And so we had to decolonize ourselves when we approached this. And it had to take this project had to hold, because we were like, this is not how we would work. We would compromise a lot of things, but actually that's not how we would cultivate, the relationship with the people and the land. And it would burn us, it really burned us out as well, and it taught us so much because it's so much in the emergence. Being a regenerative development worker, development is also very questionable, that word. It really invites us to be able to hold that emergence and to, support and to trust that even if it's not measurable in the way we would know it, there is also this effects or impacts, because impact is also another term to heal the narrative on, but how can that's still something uncertain at the moment. This is a lot of this kind of work is not so much funded, so a lot of the initiatives are not well developed, but there are a lot of heart from people working in this field, like the networks I'm part of. They're so dedicated, small grassroots weavers, small humanitarian efforts that are really regenerative, but they're quite limited in resources, and to sustain it is they have to adapt to the old model to be able to meet the kind of acceptability and measurability. Perhaps there is a need to meet both, like you work with the UN system and you work with, like right now, we're bringing in the consciousness as an approach to addressing food systems and leadership. So I don't think it's perfect enough. I don't think any system is perfect. And I also wouldn't entrust the entire thing to them. I would entrust it more to who are the holders and keepers of the landscape, and the people who are the guardians and custodians, the leaders in that place, who are really in the end, the UN or other institutions will leave anyway. So how do we nurture their leadership in the end, in this, in all of this, really?
No, but again, it's just been really lovely, this conversation, because it just gives, in one person's dedicated work of being in service to the world, a real lesson on so many aspects that are core to how working regeneratively is different than the kind of solutioneering approach that the UN has unfortunately built into it with its quantity focused and kind of how many participants met and how many, like, everything is quantified. Every project needs to know what its outcomes are before you start it. And it's like, why would I do the project if I knew what the outcome is? Life isn't like that. My hope is that you're working with those in the UN system and around the UN system that are bringing in this qualitative, place-sourced, culture-sourced, deeply rooted in place approach that ultimately helps people to reconnect to each other and place. And then on the other hand, like, for example, the work that I'm doing with Tobias Lute and ETH Zurich, in one of the top universities of the world, bringing in exactly the same bridge, like saying, of course, we need science and engineering. And yes, you're a brilliant institute for science and engineering. You're the MIT of Europe. But you've also noticed that life sometimes is stranger than fiction, and science is a form of fiction. And that sometimes it just doesn't connect, sometimes it just doesn't work. So without dismissing the power of science and technology and quantifying things and all of that kind of way of working, can we not, into an academic institution of that quality, also bring in the value of what you've so beautifully illustrated, like how to listen to indigenous knowledge that is still in the land everywhere, and how to listen to living systems, processes, and try to fit into them. And I think that we're just like, from our human perspective, it's always a bit frustrating. It always takes slow time culture change. But what I'm seeing is it's happening everywhere, and we are changing the discourse. Like, you mentioned Gen and Guy education, and if you think, in 2005, it was truly radical to have a worldview dimension in the sustainability conversation, to talk to people about, social is important, ecological is important, economic is important, but don't you see that how we approach these and how we approach how they're interconnected is to do with the lenses we're putting onto the world, and those are currently very limited. So we need to also pay attention to that. And worldview was just a sort of clever way of, back then in 2005, you couldn't name the word spirituality without being completely dismissed. And that's also shifted. That, like, you can now talk about spirituality in the UN system and you're not immediately laughed out of the room. 20 years ago, unfortunately, it was like that. And so I think in a similar way, with the wonderful work that Nora is doing, and from so many different angles, we are bringing in listening to indigenous elders, listening to qualities, working with the sensing, feeling, and intuiting, as well as the thinking and the analytical. So for me, it's been a really hopeful conversation so far. And I'm just wanting to double check with you. Shall we just continue in the same recording, or shall I stop and then we do a second recording with the project that you want to interview me on? I'm happy to just...
we can. I think we can record a new one if it helps. If the, and I really and I can turn on the lights as well, because it's getting dark here. It's 6 p.m. But thank you for such a very definitely. When you ask questions, it helps me reflect. Sometimes I'm so much in my have to do these things, and I don't end up reflecting on my own. So I'm really grateful, and thank you for the work you've done ahead, Daniel, because you're saying this worldview that you have been doing earlier in the early 2000s, along with people like Mais or Kosha, and you pioneered that with Ross. And I think it took a lot of like people who dared to dream, and then when people like us in the younger generation are seeing, like, it's so important to be able to refer how valuable this is, because a lot of people have laid out the road as well for us to make it easier to explain it better, that it's important. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge that as well, because it was really, really pioneering for me to read the EDE material to facilitate it, as it really helped kind of, as a development worker, you cannot do social, ecological, economic without the mindset shift effectively. You cannot do these things. Even like an IPC scientist I interviewed on how do we work with bioregional governance, like what we're going to talk in the next few minutes, is like, and she said, I've worked with several governments and in climate adaptation. It is a mindset shift that is needed. It's not about the solutions or the technicalities, and that's so important in what this worldview affects, this worldview dimension of change that you all laid out. Is really great.
It's beautiful and sometimes funny for me to reflect on that. That suddenly 20 years go past or 25 years go past, and you move from saying the same thing to John Todd and Fritjof Capra and David Orr. Like I had or Satish, all these beautiful mentors that I had who are in the generation before me, at Schumacher College and at Center for Alternative Technology, or in Findhorn and through Gen and Guy Education. And yeah, now you're saying this, and it feels healthy, because it means we're beginning, and I'm sure you're an inspiration to many younger people that you work with, and so it's we're building the tribe of the regeneration rising together, and that's wonderful. So I'll thank you so much. I'll just stop, and then we'll record the other session.
And let me turn on the lights, because I feel like I'm in like outer space.